My name is Renard Aubuchon, and I was 71 years old the day I walked back into a war I'd been told was over. Not a shooting war. Not yet. Something worse. The kind of war where your species gets pushed off the table while everyone smiles and calls it diplomacy. I'd spent the last 6 years on 40 acres outside Beaufort, South Carolina, growing tomatoes and fixing an airboat engine that didn't want to be fixed. My wife, Claire, had died the 3rd year of my retirement. My daughter, Margot, called every Sunday at 0800 and pretended she wasn't checking whether I'd eaten. I had a hound named Boudreaux who snored like a malfunctioning ventilation unit and a pension that covered the taxes. That was the shape of my life when Commander Estelle Broussard landed a shuttle in my soybean field without clearance and without apology. She was 44, dark hair cut to regulation length, Creole features sharp enough to read in low light. I'd known her father, Gunnery Sergeant Alain Broussard, killed at the Cassini relief action when she was 9. She'd climbed from enlisted to the academy to command track on a spine made of rebar and spite. "Admiral," she said, standing on my porch with red Carolina clay on her boots. "The Senate Appropriations Committee dissolved the Kepler 186F development program yesterday. Funding zeroed. Personnel reassigned. The colony site's been redesignated as a hazardous environment preserve. They're pulling every asset off-world within 60 days. I leaned against the porch rail and watched Boudreaux investigate her boot with great scientific rigor. "That colony was the only deep frontier foothold we had left," I said. "Yes, sir." "And the Concord species voted to restrict our expansion corridor to the 3 systems we already occupy. Ratified Tuesday. The Vethrani abstained. Everyone else voted yes." I looked at my tomato plants. 6 weeks from harvest, the best crop I'd grown since Claire taught me how to read soil pH. "Come inside," I said. "Coffee's still hot. Here is what you need to understand about Kepler 186F, because what the galaxy saw and what the planet actually was were 2 different things. The galaxy saw a Deathworld. That was the official Concord classification. A Category 7 biohazard environment, unsuitable for sustained habitation by any recognized species. Atmospheric oxygen at 22%, with volatile organic compound concentrations high enough to trigger respiratory distress in most galactic biologies within 40 minutes. Surface gravity at 1.14 standard. Ambient bacterial load dense enough to register on sensors as a biological weapons signature. Tectonic instability. A magnetosphere that fluctuated unpredictably, exposing the surface to periodic radiation spikes. Weather systems that generated wind speeds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour in what the survey team cheerfully called the mild season. The Vethrani called it Shalastiv, the breathing poison. The Oravani refused to send survey drones below the cloud layer. The Concord's official position was that humanity's attempt to colonize the planet represented either desperation or insanity, and they treated both diagnoses with the same prescription: pity, distance, and quiet obstruction. But I'd spent 11 years commanding the combined frontier development fleet before my retirement, and I knew something the Concord's analysts hadn't bothered to learn. Kepler 186F was alive. Not in the metaphorical sense. Not alive like poets call the ocean alive. The planet's biosphere was a single interconnected metabolic system, a web of microbial, fungal, and macroscopic organisms, so dense and so deeply interlocked that the soil, the atmosphere, the water cycle, and the weather itself were all expressions of one enormous biological process. The storms weren't random. The bacterial load wasn't contamination. The tectonic instability followed patterns that mapped onto seasonal nutrient migration. Everything on that world was a living system doing what living systems do: cycling, adapting, responding. And for the 3 years before my retirement, my teams had been learning to listen to it, not fight it. Listen. We had agricultural stations producing modified grain in soil that every Concord botanist said would dissolve Earth origin root structures within 72 hours. We had atmospheric processors that worked with the VOC load instead of filtering it, converting the planet's own chemistry into supplemental energy. We had HAB units designed to flex with the seismic rhythm rather than resist it. None of it was pretty. All of it worked. And the Senate, pressured by a Concord that didn't want humanity anchored in deep frontier space, lobbied by corporate interests that wanted those development credits redirected to safe corridor commerce, had just killed it. Broussard laid it out for me at my kitchen table. The situation was worse than a funding cut. 3 other conquered species, the Oravani, the Dravathi, and the Tessic Combine, had filed territorial interest claims on the Kepler 186 system within hours of the Senate's announcement. Not because they wanted the planet, because they wanted the corridor. Kepler 186 sat at the junction of 3 unexplored transit lanes that opened into what the Concorde's own deep survey data suggested was the richest unclaimed resource belt in the galactic arm. Whoever held Kepler 186 controlled access to all 3 lanes. The colony had never been just a colony. It was a choke point, and every species in the Concorde except humanity had been playing the board while we argued about line items. "How many people are still on the surface?" I asked. 1,400, mostly agricultural and engineering staff. Some families. 47 children under 12. The youngest is 8 months. I set my coffee down. "Who's the ranking officer on site?" "Major Therese Castellan. She's good, Admiral. Former combat engineer, 2 tours on the Rathani border, but she's got no fleet support, no political cover, and 60 days before the pullout order goes hard." "What about the development infrastructure? The atmospheric processors, the ag stations, the seismic flex systems?" "Slated for disassembly and recovery. The Senate wants the hardware credited against next year's inter-system development budget, meaning they were going to strip the bones and sell them for parts." I stood up and walked to the window. Boudreau was lying in the shade of my tool shed, one ear cocked toward a mockingbird that had been tormenting him all spring. "Estelle," I said, using her first name for the first time since she'd arrived. "Why did you come to me? I'm retired. I have no commission, no staff, no authority, and a dog who needs his heartworm medication on Thursday." "Because you designed the colony architecture. You wrote the operational manual. You trained every crew chief on that surface." She paused. "And because the people down there asked me to come get you." I looked at her. She met it. "They didn't ask for a fleet, sir. They asked for you. I want to be honest about this, because honesty is what I've got left, and it's the only currency that spends right. I went back because I was angry. Not righteous anger. Not noble anger. The kind of anger that lives in your chest like a coal that never quite goes out. The anger of a man who spent 38 years in uniform building something real, something that worked, and then watched comfortable people in clean offices take it apart because the math was easier if they pretended it didn't matter. Claire would have told me I was being a stubborn old fool. She would have been right. She also would have packed my bag and driven me to the shuttle herself, because she understood that some kinds of stubborn are the only thing that keeps the world turning. I made 3 calls before I left Beaufort. The first was to Rear Admiral Colette Navarro, retired, living in Corpus Christi, and teaching maritime strategy at the War College satellite campus. Navarro had commanded my logistics train for 7 years during frontier operations. She could move 10,000 tons of materiel through a hostile corridor using assets that existed only on paper and willpower. "Renard," she said when I told her what I wanted. "I've been bored enough to reorganize my husband's tackle box by species and lure weight. When do we leave?" The second call was to Master Chief Petty Officer Dalton Pogue, retired, running a welding shop in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Pogue had forgotten more about field expedient structural engineering than most academy graduates would ever learn. He was 63, built like a dock piling, and spoke in sentences so efficient they could have been measured by the word and charged by the syllable. "You need me on a Deathworld," he said flatly. "I do. I'll need my own toolkit. Bring it. And I'm not saluting anybody. I wouldn't dream of asking." The third call was to Dr. Abena Osei, civilian xenobiologist, 59, formerly attached to the Kepler 186F survey team before the Concorde reclassification pushed all civilian scientists off-world. She'd spent 4 years studying the planetary biome and had published a paper arguing that the microbial web constituted a single distributed organism. The Concorde's science directorate had buried it. They buried it because it scared them, she told me over a connection that crackled with atmospheric interference from wherever she was conducting fieldwork. "A planet-scale organism means the Deathworld classification is wrong. It's not hostile, it's immunological. We're the foreign body. It's been trying to figure out what to do with us." "And has it figured it out?" A pause. "I think it's still deciding." Then we'd better give it a reason to keep us. We arrived at Kepler 186 of 17 days later, aboard a chartered transport that had seen better centuries. Navarro had called in favors across 3 retired logistics networks and assembled a supply chain held together by personal trust and creative accounting. Pogue had loaded 11 crates of specialized equipment that he refused to manifest on any official document, saying only, "If it ain't on paper, it ain't regulated." The planet greeted us the way it greeted everyone, with a sky the color of a healing bruise, air that tasted like copper and crushed leaves, and a wind that shoved the shuttle sideways during descent, hard enough to test the landing struts. Major Castellan met us on the pad. She was 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that combat engineers develop from years of working with materials that kill you if you flinch. Her salute was regulation perfect, and her expression said everything her mouth wouldn't. She hadn't slept well in weeks. "Admiral Aubuchon, welcome back to 186-Foxtrot. I hadn't heard anyone use the operational designation in 6 years. It landed somewhere in my sternum and sat there. Major, I'm retired. Call me Renard or call me that old man who keeps asking questions. Either works." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite a smile. Close enough. "Sir," she said, because some habits outrank direct orders, "I should brief you on current status." "Walk me through it." We walked, and what I saw made the cold in my chest burn hotter. The colony, what should have been a colony, was a collection of 37 modular habitation units, 9 atmospheric processing stations, 4 agricultural domes, and a communications array that Castellan frankly admitted she was holding together with replacement parts fabricated from dismantled furniture. 1,400 people, living in structures designed for 600, growing food in soil that fought them every morning and forgave them by afternoon, breathing air that their own processors had to negotiate with every 8 hours, because the planet's VOC cycle shifted with the daylight, and no static filtration setting worked for more than a single rotation. And they were making it work, not easily, not cleanly, with baling wire and sweat and the kind of grinding daily innovation that never gets written up in engineering journals because the people doing it are too busy doing it to write anything down. I watched a crew chief named Sergeant First Class Willa Dabney run a diagnostic on Atmospheric Station 4, while simultaneously coaching a 12-year-old girl through a soil chemistry lesson. The girl's name was Theodora. She was Castellan's daughter. She held a sample jar up to the purple bruise light and said, "The manganese is higher today. The ground's hungry." Dabney looked at the girl, then at me. "She's not wrong, sir. The subsurface layer's been pulling trace minerals hard since last week's seismic shift. We adjusted the fertilizer profile twice. To match the planet's demand? To match its appetite. Dr. Osei's right. It's eating, sir. The whole thing is eating. We're just trying to set the table in a way that includes us." I knelt beside Theodora. "Who taught you to read the manganese levels?" "Sergeant Dabney, and Mom, and the ground." "The ground taught you?" She looked at me like I'd asked whether water was wet. "It changes every day. You just have to pay attention." I stood up. My knees reminded me I was 71. The cold in my chest reminded me why I'd come. The Concorde's response to my return was immediate and predictable. Oravani Ambassador Sethek issued a formal inquiry through diplomatic channels within 48 hours. Why was a retired Terran flag officer present on a world scheduled for decommission? Was this a military deployment conducted without Senate authorization? Did humanity intend to violate the development freeze? The Dravathi Commerce Directorate filed a protest citing Section 14 of the Concorde Resource Access Compact, the clause that prohibited material improvement of contested territorial claims during adjudication. They argued that my presence itself constituted material improvement, which would have been flattering if it weren't so transparently self-serving. The Tessic Combine said nothing publicly, which was how the Tessic always communicated their most serious positions. And on the Senate floor back on Earth, Senator Franklin Hadley of the Appropriations Committee gave an interview calling me a relic playing soldier on a poison rock, and recommending that my pension be reviewed for potential conflict of interest violations. The galaxy was laughing at us. An old man, 1,000 civilians, a major with furniture parts in her comms array, on a world that every species in the Concorde had written off as uninhabitable. I let them laugh, because while they laughed, Navarro was building a supply line. Colette Navarro didn't build supply chains the way logistics manuals described. She built them the way rivers carve canyons, by finding the path of least resistance and then widening it through relentless, patient pressure. Within 3 weeks of our arrival, she had established procurement relationships with 11 independent freight operators who ran cargo through the outer transit corridors. Not military contracts, personal arrangements, the kind of handshake deals that existed below the threshold of Concord trade monitoring, because nobody at the Concord monitored anything that small. She bought atmospheric processor components from a Vethrani surplus dealer who owed a favor to a retired supply officer Navarro had served with 20 years prior. She sourced agricultural substrate from a human mining cooperative on Tau Ceti that had been producing the material as waste product and dumping it. She traded repair services, Pogue's welding team fixing hull stress fractures on freighters that stopped for resupply for fuel credits, water filtration membranes, and 40 tons of structural composite that arrived in crates labeled Decorative Fencing. Decorative fencing? I asked, watching Pogue's people unload the crates with the focused intensity of professionals handling material they knew was valuable. Navarro didn't look up from her manifest. It's composite alloy sheeting, Renard, pre-cut to HAB unit panel dimensions. But if anyone asks the Concord Trade Authority, it's decorative fencing for a recreational area. We don't have a recreational area. We will. I filed the permit this morning. Section 9 of the Colonial Habitation Code requires designated leisure space for any settlement exceeding 1,200 residents. I stared at her. She stared back. Colette, you're building a fortress out of loopholes. I'm building a fortress out of whatever's available. The loopholes are just how I'm getting the material through the door. Pogue worked differently. Where Navarro operated in the abstract space of contracts and connections, Pogue operated at the boundary between metal and dirt. He took one look at the colony's structural situation and said 4 words. Everything's fighting the ground. He was right. The original HAB units had been anchored to the surface using standard deep pile foundations, rigid connections, designed to resist seismic movement. On any stable world, they'd have lasted a century. On 186-Foxtrot, the constant micro-tremors had been grinding the connection points for years, producing stress fractures in every foundation joint. The colony wasn't just fragile, it was slowly shaking itself apart. Pogue's solution was something he called slip-mount architecture, a foundation system that allowed the structures to move with the seismic rhythm instead of resisting it. He developed the concept during frontier postings where standard engineering couldn't cope with local conditions, and he'd been refining it in his head for the 6 years since retirement, with the obsessive focus of a man who knew he'd been right and was waiting for the world to catch up. The work was brutal. Every HAB unit had to be lifted, its foundations replaced, and its structural connections rebuilt using the new slip-mount joints. Pogue's team, a mix of colony engineers, volunteers, and 3 retired welders he'd recruited through channels he declined to specify, worked 16-hour shifts in atmosphere suits that fogged with condensation every 20 minutes. I worked beside them when Castellan wasn't looking. When she was looking, I worked beside them anyway, and pretended not to notice her disapproval. "Sir," she said one evening, catching me with a torque wrench in one hand and a cup of terrible coffee in the other, "you're 71 years old and you've been lifting structural panels for 9 hours. I've been supervising the lifting of structural panels. I watched you carry a 90-kilo mount bracket up a ladder. I was testing the ladder." She took the coffee from my hand, drank half of it and handed it back. "The ladder passed, sir." Noted. Dr. Osei's work was the hardest to see and the most important to understand. She'd arrived with portable sensor arrays and a theory that had gotten her laughed out of 2 academic conferences. Within a month, she'd turned the theory into data. The planetary biome, the vast interconnected web of microbial, fungal, and macroscopic life that constituted 186-Foxtrot's living system, was not simply tolerating human presence, it was processing it. The soil beneath our agricultural stations showed microbial adaptations that hadn't existed 3 years ago. Bacterial strains were evolving to metabolize human biological waste products, not slowly, over generations, but rapidly, in real time, the way an immune system learns to recognize a new protein. The atmospheric VOC concentrations near our HAB units had shifted slightly, measurably toward a profile that was less irritating to human respiratory tissue. "It's not welcoming us," Osei said, showing me culture plates in her improvised lab. "Don't romanticize it. It's processing a foreign input, the same way your gut biome processes a new food. Sometimes the process works and you absorb the nutrient. Sometimes it fails and you get sick. Are we the nutrient or the sickness?" "That's the question, isn't it?" She held up a culture plate where something purple and fibrous was growing in a pattern I didn't recognize. "This is a fungal structure that didn't exist 6 months ago. It's growing at the boundary between our agricultural soil amendments and the native substrate. It's incorporating elements of both. A hybrid. An interface. The planet is building a boundary layer between itself and us. Whether that boundary becomes a membrane or a wall depends on what we do next." "What do we do next?" Osei set the plate down and looked at me with the focused patience of a woman who had spent her career studying systems larger than herself. "We stop treating this as a construction project and start treating it as a relationship." 2 months in, the Concord stopped laughing. Ambassador Sethek requested a direct inspection of the colony, citing environmental safety concerns. The real purpose was intelligence. The Oravani wanted to know what we were building and whether it could be stopped through regulatory action before it became permanent. I granted the inspection because refusing it would have given them the legal pretext they needed to escalate. Sethek arrived with a delegation of 6. He was tall for an Oravani, close to 2 meters, with the silver-blue scaling that marked their administrative caste. His eyes, set wide in a face structured for peripheral awareness, moved constantly. He cataloged everything. I gave him the full tour, every HAB unit, every atmospheric station, every agricultural dome. I let him see the slip mount foundations, the hybrid atmospheric processors, the soil adaptation studies. I hid nothing, because what Sethek saw was exactly what I wanted him to see, a colony that was poor, improvised, undermanned, and working. He stood in agricultural dome 2 and watched Theodora, 12 years old, barefoot in amended soil, transplant seedlings into substrate that his own species botanists had classified as biochemically hostile to carbon-based agriculture. "The child is not wearing protective equipment," Sethek observed. "She doesn't need it. The soil's been amended using a hybrid protocol developed by Dr. Osei. The native microbial load in that section has been metabolically integrated." Integrated. Sethek turned the word over like a stone he suspected of being hollow. "You mean you've altered the native biology?" "No. The native biology altered itself. We provided the conditions. The planet did the rest." Sethek watched Theodora press soil around a seedling with small, careful hands. The girl looked up, saw him watching, and said, "You have to pack it firm but not tight. If you pack it tight, the mycelium can't breathe." "Mycelium," Sethek repeated. "The fungal network. It connects the roots to the deep substrate. Sergeant Dabney says it's like the planet's nervous system." Theodora looked at the Oravani with the uncomplicated directness of a child who had grown up on a world where everything was difficult and nothing was pretend. "Your feet are too big. You're standing on a junction node." Sethek looked down, moved his foot. Theodora nodded approval and went back to work. The ambassador spent another hour inspecting the colony. When he left, his formal report to the Concord stated that the human settlement on Kepler 186F presented no regulatory violations and demonstrated no material military improvement. 3 days later, the Oravani filed an amended territorial claim that tripled the scope of their corridor access request. They weren't laughing anymore. They were accelerating. I called a council of war. Not because I wanted a war, I wanted the opposite of a war, but because the shape of the situation required the same discipline. Navarro, Pogue, Castellan, Osei, Dabney, and a civilian engineer named Howard Pruitt, who'd been on planet since the first survey mission and knew every meter of developed terrain. We gathered in the colony's central HAB unit around a table that Pogue had built from salvaged decking. "The Oravani are going to push a resource access vote at the next Concord session," Navarro said. "If the Dravathi and Tessic support it, they'll get corridor authority. Once they have that, our development rights become conditional on Concord approval, which they won't grant. Timeline? Castellan asked. 90 days, maybe less if the Tessic signal early support. Can the Senate block it? The Senate, I said carefully, is the body that defunded us. Senator Hadley's position is that 186-Foxtrot is a waste of resources and our presence here is an embarrassment. Prewitt, who rarely spoke in meetings, cleared his throat. Then we need to stop being embarrassing and start being necessary. Everyone looked at him. The corridor access vote only works if the Concord can argue that humans aren't effectively utilizing the system. That Section 11 of the Territorial Compact Developed Habitation constitutes sovereign claim. If we can demonstrate that our development has reached self-sustaining threshold before the vote, the claim is locked regardless of what the Concord wants. Self-sustaining threshold, Castellan repeated. We're running on improvised supply lines and decorative fencing. The threshold is defined by output, not input, Prewitt said. If we can show that the colony produces enough food, energy, and atmospheric stability to support its population without external subsidy, the development clause triggers automatically. Navarro pulled up her logistics projections, studied them. We're at 62% food self-sufficiency. Atmospheric processing covers 88% of our needs. Energy is the gap. We're still dependent on imported fuel cells for 30% of our power generation. 30% in 90 days, I said. That's the war. Osei had been quiet. Now she spoke. There's another option. The planetary biome generates enormous metabolic energy through its organic chemical cycling. The VOC load isn't pollution. It's exhaust from a biological engine. If we can tap into that cycle without disrupting it, harvest energy from the biome's own metabolic output, we close the power gap using the planet itself. Can it be done? I asked. I don't know. I think so. But it requires something we haven't tried. What? Direct interface with the deep fungal network. Not sampling it, not studying it from the surface, connecting to it. Running conduits into the mycelial substrate and allowing the energy exchange to flow in both directions. Both directions meaning we give something back. Meaning we become part of the cycle, not parasites drawing energy off, participants. The planet takes something from us: waste heat, biological output, CO2, whatever the mycelium decides to metabolize, and we take energy in return. You're describing symbiosis, Castellan said. I'm describing what the planet's already been trying to build. Osei pointed at the culture plate data she'd spread across the table. The boundary layer, the interface fungi, it's been reaching for us, Therese. The question is whether we reach back. I want to be honest about this part too, because this is where it got hard. Not physically, it had been physically hard since day one. Hard in the way that wakes you at 0300 and sits on your chest. What Osei proposed meant changing the planet. Not destroying it, not conquering it, but integrating with it at a level that couldn't be undone. If we ran conduits into the mycelial network and established a metabolic exchange, we would become part of 186-Foxtrot's biology, and it would become part of ours. The atmospheric adaptations would accelerate, the soil chemistry would shift further toward compatibility, the biome would begin treating human presence not as a foreign body to be processed, but as a component to be maintained, and the planet, the living, breathing, world-scale organism that had existed for billions of years before we arrived, would never be what it was before we touched it. I stood on the colony's eastern ridge at sunset and looked at the landscape. Purple-green vegetation stretching to a horizon that curved more sharply than Earth's. Bioluminescent threads pulsing faintly in the gathering dark. The mycelial network's surface expression, like veins of light beneath the skin of the world. Wind carrying the copper leaf scent that I'd stopped noticing weeks ago because my own respiratory system had already begun adapting. The way a body adapts to altitude, this world was alive, complete, functioning on a scale that made human engineering look like a child's drawing, and I was proposing to plumb it like a boiler. Osei found me there. She stood beside me in the dark and said nothing for a while, which was one of her better qualities. You're not sure, she said finally. I'm sure it will work. I'm not sure it's right. Those two things have been in different rooms for as long as I've been a scientist. How do you reconcile them? Osei looked at the bioluminescent threads. One of them pulsed brighter as she watched, responding maybe to the vibration of her voice, or the heat of her body, or something we didn't have instruments sensitive enough to detect. You don't, she said. You carry both. You do the work with one hand and you hold the doubt with the other. And you never put the doubt down, because the day you put it down is the day you stop being careful enough to deserve what you're touching. We began the interface project 9 days later. Pogue designed the conduit system, a lattice of thermally conductive channels that would extend from our power generation stations down through the amended soil layer and into the deep mycelial substrate. The conduits were porous, designed to allow molecular exchange across their walls. Energy would flow up. Biological material would flow in both directions. The installation required excavation into substrate that was dense with living tissue. Every cut into the ground was, in the most literal sense, a wound. Osei monitored every incision. She had developed a protocol based on her observation that the mycelial network's damage response was faster and more targeted than any biological healing mechanism she'd ever studied. Small wounds closed within hours. Larger ones triggered a redistribution of resources from adjacent network nodes and immune response that prioritized repair over all other functions. The key was to wound slowly, consistently, and predictably, giving the network time to adapt rather than triggering a full immune cascade. Think of it as surgery, she told the installation team. Not mining. The patient is conscious and watching. The planet watched. I could feel it in ways I couldn't quantify and wouldn't try to. A change in the air the morning after the first conduit went in. A shift in the bioluminescent pulse frequency around the installation site. The soil temperature near the conduits rose 2 degrees, which Osei said was the mycelial network increasing metabolic activity near the wound. Examining us, tasting the metal and composite we'd introduced, deciding what to do with it. For 3 days, nothing happened. The conduits sat in the ground, inert, surrounded by soil that was alive but unresponsive. On the 4th morning, Dabney woke me at 0500. "Sir, you need to see Power Station 2. I pulled on boots and walked through pre-dawn darkness to the station. Pogue was already there, standing at the monitoring console with a torque wrench in his back pocket and an expression I had never seen on his face in 20 years of acquaintance. "The conduits are generating," he said. I looked at the readouts. He was right. Energy was flowing up through the conduit lattice, not much, not yet, but measurably, consistently, and increasing. "What's flowing down?" I asked. Osei, who had apparently not slept, looked up from her sensor array. "Waste heat, CO2 from the HAB unit's ventilation exhaust, and something else." "What?" "Microbiome. Our microbiome. Skin cells, respiratory bacteria, the biological material we shed constantly just by being alive. The mycelium is metabolizing it. It's eating our dead cells and feeding us energy." She paused. "It's what I said. An interface. The planet is deciding to keep us." Pogue looked at the readouts, then at the ground, then at me. "I've been an engineer for 41 years, he said. "I've never built anything that the ground itself wanted to help hold up." The energy output climbed. Day by day, conduit by conduit, the mycelial network increased its metabolic exchange rate as though testing the connection, probing its limits, then gradually expanding throughput the way a prudent engineer would conservatively, with margin, measuring twice before committing. Within 6 weeks, we closed the power gap, self-sustaining threshold. Dr. Osei published her findings on an open academic channel. Not a political document, not an argument. Raw data, methodology, results. She let the numbers speak because numbers don't negotiate. The Concord Science Directorate tried to bury it. They couldn't. The data was already propagating through independent academic networks faster than institutional suppression could contain it. 3 Vethrani research teams requested access to our methodology within a week. A Dravathi Biological Sciences Institute, technically part of the Commerce Directorate, but staffed by scientists who were scientists first and Dravathi second, published a corroborating analysis based on their own long-range sensor data. Kepler 186f was not a death world. It had never been a death world. It was a living system that had been misclassified by civilizations that could not imagine a biosphere they couldn't dominate, and the humans crawling around on its surface, poor, stubborn, undermanned, and ridiculous, had done what no species in Concord history had managed. They had asked the planet what it wanted, and then listened to the answer. Senator Hadley called me directly. The communication lag was 14 minutes each way. which gave our conversation the strange, measured rhythm of people who had to be precise, because the silence between statements lasted long enough to reconsider. Admiral Aubuchon, the Appropriations Committee has received your colony's self-sufficiency filing. I want to be candid with you. I'd appreciate that, Senator. 14 minutes of silence. The political landscape has shifted. The Oravani corridor vote failed at committee level. The Vethrani withdrew support after your Dr. Osei's publication made the scientific community impossible to ignore. The Tessic Combine has formally requested observer status at your colony, and I'm getting constituent mail. What kind of constituent mail? 14 minutes. The kind where people tell me they named their children after the girl who told an alien ambassador to move his feet. I closed my eyes, opened them. Senator, what do you need from me? 14 minutes. I need you to tell me this is real, not a stunt, not a temporary arrangement, not a retirement project. I need to know this holds. I thought about Osei's culture plates, Pogue's slip mount foundations, Dabney's atmospheric negotiations, Theodora's soil readings, the bioluminescent threads pulsing beneath our feet like the slow heartbeat of something too large to comprehend and too alive to ignore. Senator, 6 months ago, the ground under my feet was trying to figure out whether to reject us. This morning, it grew a new fungal structure around one of our conduits that increased energy throughput by 11%. The planet is building us in. We're not visitors anymore. We're becoming tissue. 14 minutes, the longest yet. The full development appropriation will be in the supplemental budget. You'll have it in 30 days. And Admiral, yes, Senator? The committee would like to formally reactivate your commission, Frontier Development Command, full authority. I looked at my hands, old hands, scarred from the torque wrench in the conduit installation, and the morning I'd helped Pogue lift a foundation bracket because the hydraulic lift was down and the work needed doing. I'll serve, Senator, but the commission stays on 186-Foxtrot. I'm not coming back to a desk. Understood. Hadley out. The Tessic Combine sent their observer delegation 8 weeks later. 3 analysts, a biologist, and a military attaché who thought she was being subtle about assessing our defensive posture. The senior analyst was named Cole Vren, compact, precise, with multifaceted eyes that processed light in spectrums I couldn't see, and opinions she delivered with the flat confidence of someone who'd never been wrong and was beginning to suspect this might be the day. I gave them the same tour I'd given Sethic. Open access, nothing hidden. Vren stood at the edge of Agricultural Dome 4, the newest, built entirely with slip-mount architecture and integrated conduit systems, and watched the fungal interface layer that now visibly connected our substrate amendments to the native soil. It pulsed faintly, a rhythm that Osei had mapped to the planet's deep substrate metabolic cycle. It was, objectively, beautiful. Your colony is not a colony, Vren said. No, it is an organ. You have allowed this world to grow you into its body. She turned those multifaceted eyes on me. Every civilization in the conquered has approached Class 7 biospheres as environments to be conquered, terraformed, overwritten. You have done something we do not have a word for. We call it farming, I said. Where I grew up, we called it working the land. You don't conquer soil, you come to terms with it. And if the terms change, if the organism rejects you, then we adapt or we leave, same as any relationship, but we don't start by assuming the worst. Vren was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The Combine has territorial interest claims filed on the Kepler 186 corridor. I'm aware. I will recommend they be withdrawn." I looked at her. Not from generosity, she clarified. From intelligence. A species that can become part of a Class 7 biosphere has demonstrated an adaptive capability that changes the strategic calculus permanently. Contesting your claim would require us to assume this is your only Deathworld. I do not think it is. It's the only one we've been invited into. So far. She folded her manipulator limbs in the Tessic gesture I'd learned meant something between respect and wariness. Admiral, your species is not what we thought you were. What did you think we were? Loud, fragile, temporary. A pause that carried weight. We were correct about one of those. The months turned. The colony grew. Not fast, nothing on 186-Foxtrot happened fast except the weather, but steadily, in the way that real growth happens. Root system first, visible structure later. New settlers arrived, families mostly. Engineers and farmers and teachers and a retired Marine gunnery sergeant named Dolores Vick who'd served under me at Cassini and showed up with a footlocker full of hand tools and a 9-year-old grandson named Augustin, who bonded with Teodora within an hour and spent the first week following Dabney around with the religious devotion of a child who has found a grown-up worth studying. We built new domes, slip-mount architecture from the foundation up, conduit integrated. The fungal interface layer included in the design specifications rather than retrofitted. Pogue trained local crews until they didn't need him standing over them, which he handled with the grace of a man who understood that the highest compliment to a teacher is redundancy. Osei's research expanded. The mycelial network was not merely accommodating human presence. It was incorporating human biological data into its own adaptive processes. Fungal structures near the colony showed genetic markers that had no analog in any sample taken before human arrival. The planet was using us, learning from us, building new tools from the biological information we provided simply by living on its surface. "It's not just keeping us," Osei said one evening, reviewing data by the light of the bioluminescent web that now extended visibly up the walls of her laboratory dome, the network having apparently decided that the interior of her workspace was part of its territory. "It's becoming something new because we're here, and we're becoming something new because it is." I thought about Claire, about the way she'd tended her garden in Beaufort, patient, attentive, willing to let the soil teach her things that no manual could. She'd understood something I'd spent a career in uniform learning the hard way. The strongest structures are the ones that grow rather than the ones you build. On the anniversary of our arrival, I stood on the eastern ridge at sunset, the same spot where I'd wrestled with the rightness of what we were doing. The view had changed. Not because we'd built more, though we had, but because the planet had responded. The bioluminescent network pulsed brighter near the colony, a visible expression of increased metabolic activity around our presence. The vegetation had shifted color at the boundary zones where our agricultural amendments met native soil. Neither the deep purple-green of untouched biosphere, nor the familiar green of Earth-origin crops, but something between. A new color that didn't have a name yet. Teodora found me there. She was 13 now, taller, quieter in the way that children become quiet when they're processing more than they can say. She stood beside me and looked at the same view. "Sergeant Dabney says the mycelium grew through the wall of Dome 6 last night," she said. "Not damaging it, just growing into it, like it wanted to be inside." "What did Dabney do?" "She left it. She said if the planet wants to come inside, we should probably let it." I smiled. The wind pushed against us, warm from the day's absorbed heat, carrying that copper leaf scent that had become the smell of home. "Admiral?" Do you think it knows we're here? Like, really knows? Not just chemically, but knows." I looked at the bioluminescent threads pulsing below us, at the hybrid color of the boundary vegetation, at the conduit system Pogue had built, now half overgrown with fungal structures the planet had added to our engineering because it had found a better configuration than ours. "I think," I said carefully, "that we're asking that question in a language the answer doesn't fit inside. The planet doesn't know us the way we know each other. But it's changed because we're here, and we've changed because it's here. And maybe that's what knowing is, when the knower is the size of a world." Teodora considered this with the seriousness of a child raised on soil that demanded precision. "Mom says you came back because you were angry." "Your mother's a perceptive woman. Are you still angry?" I looked at my hands. The scars from the torque wrench had faded. New ones had replaced them from conduit installation, from agricultural work, from the daily labor of living on a world that required effort the way breathing requires effort, constantly and without negotiation. "No," I said, "I'm not angry anymore." "What are you?" The bioluminescent web pulsed. The wind carried the sound of Dabney's crew working on Dome 7, the rhythmic clang of Pogue's tools, the low hum of atmospheric processors negotiating their evening exchange with a sky that had learned to expect them. "Rooted," I said. The Concord reclassified Kepler 186 14 months after our arrival. The new designation was Category 1, Sustained Integrated Habitation. The first planet in Concord records to receive the classification. They had to create it for us because no existing category described what we'd done. Sethek filed a formal objection. It was overruled. The Vethrani, the Tessic, and 2 species I'd never dealt with, the Praley and the Hessen Cooperative co-sponsored the reclassification. The Dravathi abstained. The Oravani stood alone. The corridor access vote never came to the floor. And in the Senate chamber back on Earth, during the appropriation debate for the expanded Kepler 186 development program, a first-term senator from New Mexico held up a soil sample that Teodora Castellan had sent her rich, dark, shot through with purple mycelial threads, alive in a way that soil from any other world in human space was not, and said, "This is what happens when we stop trying to conquer and start trying to belong." The appropriation passed unanimously. I'm 73 now. My knees hurt more than they did 2 years ago, and Pogue has started leaving stools at workstations he knows I'll visit, which is his way of caring and my cue to accept it. Boudreaux died last spring. I buried him on the eastern ridge, in soil that the mycelial network threaded through within a week. Osei says the planet is metabolizing him, incorporating him. I find I don't mind. It seems right that he should become part of the place where I intend to stay. Margot came for a visit last month. She stood in Agricultural Dome 2 and watched her old man kneel in alien soil, hands deep in substrate that pulsed faintly with the rhythm of a world-sized heartbeat, and she said, "Dad, you look like Mom in her garden." I couldn't answer for a minute. When I could, I said, "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time." The galaxy mocked us, called me a relic, called the colony a vanity project, called the planet a death trap. They saw a poisoned world, an old man, and a handful of stubborn civilians, and they calculated correctly that by every metric they used, we should have failed. They didn't understand the metric that mattered. Every empire in the Concord approached new worlds the same way: assess, classify, overcome. They built on worlds by defeating them. They saw a planet's resistance as an enemy to be conquered, its biology as a problem to be solved, its nature as an obstacle between them and the resource beneath. We did that too for a while. We're human. Conquest is in our toolbox. But it's not the only tool we carry. Somewhere in the long, strange history of our species, we learned something that I don't think the Conquered has a word for. We learned that the soil is not the enemy of the seed. We learned that the thing that resists you might be the thing that holds you up, if you stop pushing and start listening. We learned that the strongest foundation is not the one you drive into the ground, but the one the ground agrees to become. Claire knew it. She knew it every morning she walked into her garden with coffee and patience and dirty hands. Teodora knows it. She knew it before she could name it, the way children know things that adults have to learn twice. I sit on the eastern ridge in the evenings and watch the bioluminescent web pulse beneath the surface of a world that is not mine, was never mine, and has chosen to carry me anyway. The light follows patterns that Osei is still mapping, rhythms older than our species, older than the Concord, older than the corridor disputes and the territorial claims and the small, frightened mathematics of empires that count strength in tonnage and reach. The planet breathes. I breathe with it. They called it a death world because it was too alive for them to survive. We survived because we were too stubborn to stop asking what it needed from us. There's a fungal structure growing up the west wall of my quarters. It appeared 3 weeks ago, a thin lattice of purple-white filament that pulses faintly when I speak. Osei wants to study it. Pogue wants to frame it. Dabney says it's the planet's way of keeping tabs on me. I think it might be a hand, reaching out from inside a body the size of a world, learning the shape of the small, warm thing it chose to grow around. I let it stay. The fortress is not the walls we built. It never was. The fortress is the agreement between what lives here and what arrived here, the slow daily negotiation between a world that could kill us and chose not to, and a species that could have conquered and chose instead to kneel in the dirt and ask what grows. That's the strongest thing we ever put into the ground on 186-Foxtrot. Not metal, not composite, not the ingenuity of engineers or the stubbornness of an old man with a torque wrench. A question asked with open hands, "What do you need from us?" And a world ancient and alive and breathing, that answered by growing us in.